Is Democracy Founded on Reason? Part 8. By James P. Pierce. There is strong synthesis of political theology and the philosophical contrast between secular democracy and Christian models of divine governance. Let's take this integrated explanation of Christian nationalism, Orthodox nationalism, and the Christian critique of democracy, and show how these ideologies intersect within the historical and theological reasoning that gave rise to them. Below is a structured, academic-style synthesis. It links Christian and Orthodox nationalism directly to democratic theory, divine will, and the integration, or conflict, between church and state authority. 1. Integration of Christian/Orthodox nationalism with democratic notions. Christian nationalism and Orthodox nationalism emerge from a shared conviction that political legitimacy must ultimately derive from divine, not merely human, authority. Both reject the idea that the state can be morally neutral or purely secular. Instead, they see faith as essential to the moral foundation of a nation, and democracy as legitimate only if it reflects divine moral order. Christian nationalism, primarily in Protestant and Catholic contexts, asserts that the democratic process itself should serve God's will, that the will of the people is valid only insofar as it aligns with biblical morality. Orthodox nationalism, by contrast, is less about democratic participation and more about cultural symphonia, the historic harmony between church and state, as seen in Byzantium or Tsarist Russia. It claims that the Orthodox Church embodies the soul of the nation, so the political system, whether monarchic or democratic, must preserve orthodoxy as the nation's unifying identity. In both cases, democracy becomes conditional, not absolute. Freedom is valued, but only as freedom within divine order, not freedom to reject God's law. 2. Democracy, political power, and divine authority. The central theological tension arises between divine sovereignty and human sovereignty. In secular democracy, legitimacy flows upward, the people are the source of power, vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. In Christian theology, legitimacy flows downward, power is entrusted by God to human rulers as stewards, Romans 13:1. Thus, Christian and Orthodox thought both challenge the Enlightenment assumption that man's reason alone can create just order. If politics is cut off from the transcendent, democracy risks collapsing into moral relativism or oligarchy where power serves human appetites rather than divine justice. Key theological principle. Authority, when divorced from God, becomes tyranny under the guise of liberty. This critique has been echoed by both Catholic and Orthodox thinkers. Pope Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors, 1864, condemned the idea that moral truth can be determined by majority opinion. Dostoevsky, writing from the Orthodox view, warned that liberal democracy without God leads to nihilism. Everything is permitted. 3. The role of covenant and the moral function of governance. In both traditions, governance is covenantal, a sacred trust, not a social contract. The state's role is to uphold divine justice and cultivate virtue in its citizens. For Catholics, this is rooted in natural law, Aquinas, where reason discovers divine moral order. For the Orthodox, it is expressed through symphonia, the cooperation between emperor and patriarch to safeguard the faith. Democracy, then, is acceptable only insofar as it reflects divine law, i.e., when it protects life, family, worship, and the moral order revealed in scripture and tradition. When it deviates, example through secular materialism or permissive moral laws, it ceases to be true governance and becomes rebellion against divine authority. For historical application, from monarchic stewardship to secular revolt. Historically, Christian and Orthodox nationalism arose as responses to the secular revolutions that displaced religious monarchy. The French Revolution, 1789, dethroned the church and enthroned reason, a total inversion of the Christian political order. The American Revolution, 1776, maintained religious liberty but grounded rights in natural law rather than divine revelation. The Russian Revolution, 1917, violently rejected the Orthodox Tsar and Church, leading to militant atheism and the eventual ideological vacuum filled by communism. These upheavals represented, in the Christian view, the democratization of sin where human will replaced divine will as the measure of law. Hence, modern Christian and Orthodox nationalists often interpret democracy not as evil per se, but as unstable without divine orientation. The will of the people must be disciplined by moral absolutes, or it degenerates into chaos or oligarchic control by elites, what classical theology calls the corruption of the polis. 5. The democratic dilemma, freedom vs. truth. Christian theology acknowledges human freedom as sacred, but distinguishes between freedom for the good, to choose God's truth, and freedom from truth, license to reject divine law. Modern democracy often promotes the latter, leading to moral relativism, what Pope Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism. This is the point where Christian and Orthodox nationalism intervene, arguing that democracy cannot sustain itself without transcendent truth. Morality cannot be legislated by majorities but must reflect eternal law. Civic liberty without moral responsibility becomes spiritual bondage. Thus, divine sovereignty is the corrective principle ensuring that democracy serves truth rather than suppressing it. 6. Theological integration, the city of God vs. the city of man. Following St. Augustine's framework in the city of God, the city of man represents politics driven by pride, ambition, and self-interest. The city of God seeks the eternal good and divine justice. In democratic systems, Christians are citizens of both. They participate in civic life but owe ultimate allegiance to God. Hence, Christian and Orthodox nationalism both claim that nations should orient their laws toward the eternal, making politics a reflection of divine order, not a contest of human wills. 7. Conclusion, the integration of faith and political order. Christian and Orthodox nationalism view democracy as viable only when it acknowledges divine sovereignty and moral law. Secular democracy, detached from God, risks descending into moral confusion and oligarchic manipulation. The Catholic and Orthodox traditions both insist that governance, whether democratic or monarchic, must be an act of stewardship before God, not self-rule apart from Him. The integration of divine will with democratic participation is the enduring challenge of Christian political theology, how to reconcile human freedom with eternal truth.